Hollywood loves its prequels, doesn't it? From Star Wars to the Hobbit films to Alien Covenant and Prometheus, there seems to be a trend that filmmakers have gotten into where if a movie or series of movies have stopped making money, then they'll tell the story of how the original movie came to be in the first place. But does the idea of a prequel hold any water, or is it so full of holes that they may as well just abandon ship while they can? I'm Posh Prick Reviews, and today I'm going to be talking about the potential problems and pitfalls which come from making a movie prequel. So to give a quick dictionary definition, a prequel is a literary, dramatic, or filmic work whose story precedes that of a previous work, by focusing on events that occur before the original narrative. The intention of most prequels is they form a backstory to the characters, story, or world of the previous narrative, or give some context to said narrative that hadn't been explored up to that point. Like sequels, prequels may or may not concern themselves with the same plot from which they are derived. They may form some connections to the original work, but said connections may not be so obvious. For example, it wasn't obvious to the mass audience that Prometheus was a flat-out prequel to Alien until you see the space jockeys in the movie or the Wayland Company. In some cases, prequels can even rely on an audience knowing what will happen next in order to create a sense of dramatic or comical irony.
What is this horrid creature? A goblin mutant.
That's my wee lad, Gimli.
I say all of this to make the point that a prequel is really meant to do the same thing as a sequel, expand upon a previous story. Prequels in film have existed for as long as film itself, with one of the earliest examples being the German silent horror film Der Golem wie in die Welt kam, or translated into plain English, The Golem, How He Came into the World. While this is an early example of a prequel, the actual term prequel wouldn't be introduced until the release of the 1979 film Butch and Sundance, the early years, and the term wouldn't be popularized until the start of the Star Wars prequels in 1999. Since then, the idea of prequels have become readily accepted by the industry and the mass audience, which as a result means they've been getting more and more common. Everything from X-Men to Godzilla to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies have prequels tied to them in some way, and while sometimes that works, most often I think we'll all agree it really doesn't. One problem is that if a filmmaker is going to make a prequel, they have the added task of fitting it into the pre-established timeline of a film or film series in a way that is coherent and makes sense. For example, it's easy enough for an average filmgoer to understand that Star Wars episodes 1 through 3 take place before episodes 4 through 6, but when you start getting into movies like Rogue One and the upcoming Han Solo spin-off movie, that's where it can get a bit confusing. When does this take place in the timeline? Which characters am I following? How do they connect into everything that I've already seen? These are questions that a hardcore Star Wars fan can answer much better than an average filmgoer. This doesn't apply to all franchises which include prequels, but it certainly applies to a lot of them. The reason that it can be an issue is that just having to figure out when the movie that you're watching takes place in relation to the other movies that you've seen can compromise the experience because you're putting more brain power into that rather than enjoying the film that you're watching. But this is a problem which varies from franchise to franchise and isn't always that big of an issue. A bigger potential problem with making a prequel, especially in what is meant to be a large-scale story, is the danger of muddying the preset timeline. Certain characters can appear and certain events can happen in movies that are set before pre-existing ones that override and contradict information that was stated in the original. The most obvious example of this phenomenon in modern day would be the X-Men films. These movies are infamous for having one of the most confusing, conflicting, non-existent continuities in film history. During a flashback in X-Men The Last Stand, Xavier, who can walk now, and Magneto are shown to be friends about 20 years before the events of the film. Yet X-Men First Class, a prequel to the rest of the franchise which takes place in the 1960s, shows the two becoming bitter enemies by the end of that movie, and Xavier is left crippled. This is an example of what I mean when I say the timeline and continuity of a movie series can be muddied by a prequel if it's not handled correctly. When a filmmaker sets out to make a prequel, what they are essentially doing is weaving in an addition to a previously woven tapestry. Sometimes it's done well, other times it's really not. But in any case, they have to take great care in making sure that the connections are solid and the foundation is not harmed no matter what. Otherwise, all they'll be doing is damaging the original work, which leads me to another potential pitfall with prequels, adding something that is just not needed. In some cases, a prequel to a film would actually be best served just not being made at all. A lot of films which have prequels are such great stories in their own right that they don't warrant any kind of backstory being told about them. In the case of The Wizard of Oz, there's really no need for us, the audience, to know how and why the wizard got to Oz in the first place, yet along came Oz the Great and Powerful, a prequel to the original 1939 film, which not only tells us the story that we weren't really that interested in seeing, but also provides nothing satisfying in terms of expanding the story or the world of Oz. If all a prequel is going to do is detract from the original, then why make it at all? And this brings me to my biggest point on the problem with prequels. As previously stated, prequels are meant to expand on a pre-existing story much in the same way that a sequel is. But the advantage that a sequel has over a prequel is that it moves the story forward, whereas a prequel moves the story backwards. And that can often seem like a step in completely the wrong direction. Now don't get me wrong, there are lots of terrible sequels out there, and one of these days I will do a video on that as well, but the problem that is unique to prequels is that the backstory they are telling is by design set before the events of the original narrative that the prequel is derived from. And more often than not, the original narrative is usually the more compelling one. That's why it came first. If it wasn't, then it would bring into question why a prequel would have been made about it in the first place. For me, the most glaring example of what I'm talking about is the most infamous prequel trilogy that exists, the Star Wars prequels. There are a lot of problems with these movies, but the main one I want to focus on for this argument is the core nature of its story as contrasted with that of the original trilogy. What made the original Star Wars trilogy so compelling is that its story at its core was very simple and understandable. A young man joins a rebellion and fights to overthrow an evil empire. While there are complexities and nuances woven into that story, that is its basic core. Now contrast that to the prequel trilogy. The main core of the prequel trilogy story, or really any prequel story, is just setting up for the original, and that is it. We aren't invested in the story because it's a good story in its own right. The only reason we have to be invested in the prequels is because it's the lead up to something that we've already seen the outcome of. So no matter what story they show us that leads up to the original Star Wars trilogy, it's just not going to be as compelling as that original. Here's a good analogy. Take the character and the story of Robin Hood. He is at his most interesting and his most compelling after he has become the enemy of the rich and the friend to the poor. That is the point and stage in his life where we can get most invested. That's where the real meat of the story is. The story of how he became Robin Hood is just not going to be as enjoyable to the audience as the story of him just being Robin Hood. Same goes for the Star Wars movies, and indeed a lot of movies which have prequels. Darth Vader is at his best when he is being Darth Vader, not when he's being whiny Anakin Skywalker. The Emperor is at his best and most intimidating when he is the Emperor, not when he's being Chancellor Palpatine. The story of Star Wars is more compelling and more investing when it's about the plucky rebels taking on the evil Empire, not when it's just about setting up for that big fight to come. The conflict itself is more engaging than the lead up to the conflict, and that is the big problem with the idea of a prequel. But with that being said, sometimes it can work out, and even work out tremendously. What makes a good prequel, at least in my opinion, is not treating it like a prequel. If you treat it like you would any normal, ordinary, good movie with its own story, its own characters, and its own narrative, and then find ways to connect it to the original, then you're more likely to have a worthwhile product on your hands. But it has to be treated as a prequel second and its own story first. Movies like Red Dragon, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Wonder Woman are all prequels to pre-existing movies, but they work brilliantly because they aren't trying to be prequels. They're trying to be their own thing first, and they succeed really well whilst tying in ingeniously to the movies which led to their creation. So if by some miracle there's some big shot Hollywood filmmaker or producer watching this video and they're trying to make a prequel, maybe heed my advice. We as an audience enjoy prequels when they are good in their own right, not when all they're trying to do is tie into the original story. If your movie is spending more time trying to find ways to connect to the original, maybe take a step back and wonder if the movie that you're trying to make is actually worth making in the first place. So guys, that's my video on the problem with prequels. Sorry it went on for so long. I hope you liked it, and if there's anything that you'd like to add to the discussion, leave it in the comments below. Hit that like button, subscribe. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.